Riots over rising costs of living and unemployment plague Tunisia and Algeria, with the death toll increasing and the government struggling to find ways to calm tensions. Armies have been sent to control the streets and live ammunition's been used against the protesters. Why are the European Union and the US watching unfolding tragedies in North Africa with little or nothing to say? This is Inside Story. Good to have you with us. Welcome to this programme. David Foster in the chair. Now, these violent clashes continue across countries in North Africa, and the fury is mounting against inflation and living conditions. At least 4 people were shot dead and 6 others were seriously wounded late on Saturday when security forces clashed with protesters in central Tunisia. While in Algeria, 3 people were reported to have died, with more than 400 apparently injured. Mohammed Shakir has more.
After about a week of relative calm, protests have reignited in Tunisia. And now, anger has also erupted in neighboring Algeria. Clashes between protesters and armed forces there have led to at least 4 civilian fatalities. While the Algerian government backed down on its earlier decision to raise food prices, riots have continued. Both the governments in Tunisia and Algeria fear that the protest is turning into a political movement. Yet, despite this deadly violence, the world's powers have essentially said very little. The EU has issued a mild statement urging for restraint by government forces. In Washington, the State Department has summoned the Tunisian ambassador to express their concern about Tunisia's handling of the unrest. And in Paris, the French government has remained silent about the protests, despite a head-to-head meeting between respective foreign ministers on Friday. In fact, the French Foreign Ministry praised Tunisia for its economic development. In contrast, French President Nicolas Sarkozy was uncompromising in his condemnation of the church bombing in Alexandria, Egypt, on New Year's Eve.
France was very moved by this atrocious tragedy on the night of New Year's Eve. But France is also worried because the Alexandria bloodbath is sadly not an isolated act. We cannot accept and therefore facilitate, which is more and more looking like a particularly perverse project of religious cleansing in the Middle East. In Iraq, as well as in Egypt, Christians from the East are at home, and for most of them, they had been at home for 2,000 years.
In the Middle East, many critics of the Western position cite double standards, saying that the West only reacts to its own self-interests. Mohammed Shakir for Inside Story.
Right, let's expand on this with our guest in Doha, Saad Jabbar, an international lawyer who is Algerian. In Berlin, Samuel Lofer, head of international affairs at the Union for a Popular Movement for Youth. That's the youth wing of France's ruling party. And in Cairo, Hugh Roberts, an analyst of North African affairs and author of the book, The Battlefield, Algeria. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Mr. Roberts, let me go to you first of all. If the silence hasn't been deafening, then there hasn't been a great deal of criticism. So what have these blocs, like the United States, the European Union and other countries, got perhaps to lose by upsetting those in charge of countries such as Tunisia and Algeria?
Well, all 3 governments, the Egyptian, Algerian and Tunisian governments, are regarded as friends of the West, friends of the European Union and of the United States. And so that is a factor inhibiting any abrupt attempt to intervene. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that Western governments don't have a great deal of leverage, and they've learnt that any high-profile intervention can backfire. So I think that as things stand, apart from President Sarkozy's declaration, which of course was echoed by others following the awful bombing in Alexandria, it's not surprising that Western government responses have been fairly low-key. The United States State Department has called in the Tunisian ambassador to express its concern. Precisely what was discussed there, we don't know yet. But it should be noted that so far as the Algerian situation is concerned, the European Union's calls for restraint seem to have been followed by the Algerian authorities. The armed forces have not been deployed. It's simply the police so far that has been coping with the riots and coping on the whole with a good deal of restraint.
When you say
3 people have been killed, but when you bear
sorry, when you say friends, you don't just mean pals, do you? I mean, you mean friends in the issues of trade and perhaps more importantly with some of these countries in terms of security as well.
Yes. The security angle is, of course, particularly important in the case of Egypt, but also Algeria. Egypt is a key player from Washington's point of view in the entire Middle East situation, particularly in relation to the Israel-Palestinian problem, and notably Gaza. And that means that the Egyptian government has cards to play in its relations with Washington. It's not obvious that Washington has a great deal of leverage. The question of relations between Christian and Muslim inside Egypt is not something that Washington is liable to feel terribly concerned about. It's natural that Europeans should feel more concerned. And Algeria, of course, is an important partner of the Americans in security matters in relation particularly, of course, to the problem of terrorism in the Sahel, in the Saharan region.
Well, let's on that point go to Saad Jabbar, international lawyer, Algerian. First of all, Hugh Roberts' point about the Algerian government perhaps listening to calls for restraint. Have you seen any evidence of that?
I think the Algeria situation remains very serious, regardless how the security forces have dealt with the matter, because there are economic, political, and social deep problems in the country. The Algerian regime, since they canceled the elections in 1992, they have opted for only a security option or only security approach. In other words, they dealt with the Algerian crisis only in a heavy-handed manner. They have never dealt with good governance because the regime refuses to accept any political reform. They have never dealt with corruption because there is no accountable government there. Now the corruption is so rife that the Algerians could see it. People have become overnight billionaires. Those who are linked to the fundamental elements of the regime, the military and the intelligence service and the bureaucracy. And thirdly, socially, there is a total alienation of the majority of the popular masses.
But when it comes to security, Mr. Jabbar, when it comes to matters of security, what sort of cooperation is there between Algeria and, say, the United States?
This is the curse of those who wanted democracy in Algeria, Tunisia and Egypt. On the one hand, the Algerians have sold their situation to the United States and the West by saying, if we open up, if we are removed, if we are toppled, you'll have the Islamists. And the Americans and the West have bought to that red card, and they love to keep the status quo as it is. And for the Egyptians, for instance, the Egyptian regime presents itself as if we go, there will be no peace there. Any replacement to us will be a threat to security, to the peace process. The same thing with Tunisia. And when we look at the WikiLeaks, the United States cables, or the embassies, the American embassy's cables to the State Department from Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt and other countries, it shows that these countries are governed and run by mafia-like groups who don't care about their population. They will not engage in any sort of commitment to democratization.
I'm going to come and so on. So I'm going to come back to you in just a moment because I want to bring our third guest in who's been sitting there patiently. Samuel Laufer happens to be in Berlin but is representing the youth wing of France's ruling party. Tell us about France's involvement in, let's split this up, Tunisia and Algeria, and then take Egypt perhaps as a separate case. How much has France got to lose by sort of upsetting these people?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that's necessarily the right way to ask the question. The question also is, has France and should France intervene through piling pressure on some sovereign state government in order to implement a form of government that they believe is the right one for a country? Tunisia and Algeria are sovereign independent nations, and France doesn't have the power to decide how they are ruled. Now, of course, they are necessary allies, and President Sarkozy has said it several times that those governments, the Ben Ali, the Bouteflika government, are much preferred to potential Islamic Al-Qaeda linked government in Tunisia and Algeria. But that's not just for the sake of France, and that's why I think it's a bit unfair to say that France or the West are just pursuing their own interest in the question, because having Islamist or terrorist-linked regimes ruling in North Africa would not be just a loss for France, be it economic or influential or whatever. It would be a huge threat to world stability and to world security.
But Hugh Roberts in Cairo, listening to what Samuel Lofer is saying, talking on behalf of the French regime, perhaps suggesting that it would be improper to intervene, not so much as for trade reasons or for reasons of security, but simply on moral grounds, that they have no right to sort of interfere in what's going on. Is that the way you view it?
I think that the key point is that it would be counterproductive. There's a certain amount of hypocrisy about this. All the Europe and France and America all try to exert influence on all three regimes. What they don't want to do any longer, at any rate, is to take a high profile and intervene in a very public way, because that is something that would, on the one hand, provoke indignant resistance from the regimes in question, and on the other hand, in any case, be counterproductive. But the other point here concerning the Islamists is that all three regimes have been able to use the Islamist bogey as an argument for the status quo, and the point is that it actually should be an argument for reform, and that part of the problem is that the Western powers have tended to accept that argument for the status quo, notably in Egypt, but also in Algeria, and seem to have run out of ideas as to what reforms they should be proposing or suggesting or advising.
And also,
so there's a general sort of deadlock.
Is it not a possibility that countries in Europe particularly are worried that if they encourage destabilization, then they're going to get a flood of immigrants coming their way?
Yeah, the point is that there's a real problem in the Western attitude to reform, which is that it assumes that reform has to be destabilizing. It's been unable to propose a recipe for reform that actually stabilizes rather than destabilizes, and that means that Western recipes have become irrelevant to the situation in North Africa, just as, in fact, all the unrest that we're looking at is occurring for reasons that are actually internal, and I think one shouldn't overestimate the relevance of Western actors in any of these dramas.
Saad Jabbar, who's with us here in Doha, I don't know whether you're trying to interject as an Algerian or as a human rights activist and international lawyer, but I saw you gesticulating as though you wanted to say something.
Well, this is the problem. The French say they don't like to intervene. The Algerians, the Tunisians, the Egyptians, they don't want Western powers to intervene if possible. They stay neutral. The fact of the matter is the French are intervening. They have, if you look at the WikiLeaks cables from the United States Embassy in Algeria or Tunisia and so on, you could see that there was a preference by the French for instance, Bouteflika in 2006. And they say we don't interfere and we don't wish to intervene. But de facto, in terms of reality, they do. Look at Sarkozy, what he said 2 years ago in Tunisia. He said, if we prefer the existing regimes than Taliban regimes. That means they intervene. They are not allowing the peoples of the area to create their own form of reforms, and they are preventing reforms. They always assume any replacement to these regimes will be dictatorships and Islamists, and this is the wrong approach. Look at Egypt, for instance.
But Saad Jabbar, I mean, one of the alternatives may be, if it's not those two extremes that you point out there, it may be a government which no longer agrees with the security policy as espoused by the European Union or the United States. A lot of North African countries perhaps allowing the United States to have secret prisons there during the renditions.
Look, because if you look at the Algerians, they have been saying when they stopped the democratic process, they told the Western world, look, if we allow any political reform, you get the Islamists, the bearded lot. In other words, in the Western perceptions, you will get Al-Qaeda. And the same with the Tunisians, the same with the Egyptians. Look at the WikiLeaks cables. Therefore, what you are saying to these peoples is, keep quiet, accept these illegitimate and illegal and undemocratic regimes because it suits us in France, in the United States. In other words, we are on the side of these illegal regimes. And if you look at Egypt, for instance, believe me, you will not have lasting peace when you rely on dictatorships.
Let's bring Samuel Lofa in on this because, Saad Jabbar, you mentioned Egypt there. France's approach to Egypt has been very different to its approach to Tunisia and Algeria, with Sarkozy sort of coming out and condemning the attacks on the Christian Copts who are there. Why do you think that is?
I think he didn't just sort of condemn them, and that is also because the situation is completely different, and I mean the unrest that's going on has got absolutely nothing to do with what is happening in Tunisia and Algeria.
Yeah, but people are dying in all of these countries. People are being targeted in all of these countries. Why would he speak about one and not the other?
Certainly, and everyone...
Just for a moment, if you can bear with, let's hear from Samuel.
May I?
Please.
Yeah, I think everyone, including the French government, mourns the dead of any country. And I, as a youth, can only, of course, regret it when the youth anyway are kept from expressing themselves and such things. What's going on in Egypt is that a minority is being persecuted, discriminated, openly targeted, and that the cultural diversity of the East, of the Near East, which has lasted for millenniums and millenniums and centuries, is being threatened, and you cannot run the risk that countries like Egypt and Iraq lose their cultural and religious diversity, because that would create a very sharp state of imbalance in that part of the world that would be dangerous to everyone. And therefore you need to have a really strong stance on this and clearly express your discontent and your disagreement with what's going on. So has done President Sarkozy, so have done 100 members of parliament and senators from the Union for a Popular Movement who signed a column asking for intervention to protect the Christians of the East just a few weeks ago.
But doesn't that say at all that the fact that so much has been said about what's happening in Egypt and so little about what's happening in Tunisia and Algeria? Hugh Roberts, let me come to you to bring up a point mentioned by Saad Jabbar. He was saying that Western governments perhaps look at what's happening in these countries and say, listen, it's a choice between the government that's there or Islamists. He's suggesting that there's a third way, possibly a fourth way. Is that at all possible?
Of course it is. And in fact, this idea that certainly in Algeria and arguably in Tunisia too, the choice is between the status quo and Islamists is completely untrue. If that's what Mr. Jabbar said, I agree with him. These countries are crying out for political reform. It doesn't have to be terribly drastic. It could be piecemeal. But people in both countries need to see progress towards a more just form of government, towards the state of, towards the rule of law, which neither country really has, and above all, towards better representation for the society. The thing that these countries actually have in common, even though the unrest varies from one to another in its particular causes, they're all rather depoliticized countries. They're all countries that lack proper institutional channels for political representation, and they also lack a system of law that people can have any confidence in. And it's perfectly possible for these countries to make progress towards improving matters in these respects. The alternative isn't between, the choice isn't between the status quo and Islamists at all. That is a very threadbare excuse for inaction.
And in a sense almost hypocritical, is it not? When you hear from Western governments who try to espouse the cause of democracy in almost every country into which they go, and yet perhaps they are shoring up the regimes which suit them best rather than allowing democracy to come in.
Yes, I think that Western pretensions to be the main player in promoting democratic change need to be shot down. The main players are the Algerians, the Tunisians and the Egyptians, and there's very little useful that Western regimes can actually do. In the question... Sorry.
No. I apologise. I was sort of just coughing slightly at that point, but it gives me an opportunity to bring in Samuel Laufer one more time. I saw you looking interestingly at what the other guests have been saying. Your chance to have your say.
Yeah, rightly so. Rightly so, because you can't say, I think, that France or the European Union and the West in general, if that even means anything, are advocating a complete status quo in North Africa. I think when France and President Sarkozy are at the start of an initiative like the Union for the Mediterranean, the aim is clearly if you're trying to favour.
It's an empty institution. What are you talking about?
Please.
I mean, there is the Euromed.
I let you speak.
Listen, there is the Euromed. There is the Euromed.
Sir, please,
I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment. Samuel Laufer, please.
Okay, thank you. So the aim here is clearly to develop and to improve the lives and the living standards of the populations of this country. And anyone who has studied political transitions and such examples will know that political transition and political openness usually comes from the higher development level of a country. One of the main reasons for the riots in Tunisia right now is the level of life. And just to listen to the other guest before he goes,
whether in fact
2 years into it, of course, it's not finished yet.
Mr. Jabbar, whether in fact the repression that there is at the moment, even though you think there are alternatives to either the status quo or the Islamists, whether the repression of the street protests we're seeing at the moment might be inclined to drive people towards more extreme positions in Algeria and Tunisia?
Well, this is the point. The status quo is untenable. The French have supported the removal of the incumbent in the Ivory Coast. They support elections there and the results of elections. They didn't support the change of the constitution of the Cameroon with the United States. But when it comes to Algeria, Tunisia, and the Maghreb, the French become blind. Let me refer you to the Euromed partnership, which Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco are party to, and other countries. The European Union have poured so much money into Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco within that process, but it did not bring democratization or any sort of political reform. Therefore, all we urge from the United States and the West...
Lasted 2 years.
Then
it's lasted
20 years.
2 years. How can you draw conclusions?
It is 20 years. Other African countries who are less developed than Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco in Africa have Kenya, take Uganda, take Zambia, take other black countries.
I'm afraid if we took all of those countries, we'd have to have a lot more time than we do have at the moment. So I just want a final word from Samuel Laufer in Berlin, talking on behalf of the French government, certainly the youth movement.
It's better to keep quiet.
Yeah, not quite a government yet.
Okay, but I'm from the ruling party.
I'll still express. I'll still enjoy the opportunity I have to speak here, whatever other guests might think of it. So, on behalf of the ruling party, of course, no one can enjoy seeing the scenes that have been taking place in Tunisia and Algeria, but you can't expect France to just suddenly it wouldn't help, I think, mostly. And one of the guests said that it would be counterproductive to just have France coming and trying to suddenly unsettle things completely politically and trying to topple a regime like that.
And Hugh Robertson, in conclusion, are we seeing unrest across the whole of North Africa, a large part of North Africa, that's going to be very difficult to contain?
I think that in the medium and longer term, it's Egypt that I'm most worried about because of the problem of sectarianism. I think that in Algeria, we will see some useful political dividend. I'm fairly optimistic about Algeria. As for Tunisia, what has been happening is of historic importance. The Tunisian society has at last stood up and rebelled against very dictatorial government. That won't bring immediate positive change, but it almost certainly will help some positive change in the medium term. The Tunisian society has put down a marker here in relation to the Ben Ali regime that I think is going to bear fruit at some point. So I would not encourage alarmist perspectives for either Algeria or Tunisia. On the contrary, on the whole, somewhat hopeful ones.
Well, I know there's a great deal more left to say, but unfortunately I'm going to have the last word, and it is simply to say thank you, To all of our guests in Doha, Saad Jabbar, in Berlin, Samuel Lofer, and in Cairo, Hugh Roberts. Thank you to those of you who've been watching for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Until next time, bye-bye.